Last time, we left our heroes dangling by a thin thread over the abyss of bankruptcy. Square had become an independent company, headed a developing union, and released a handful of games only to have each and every move result in disaster. The sales were low, the union was disbanded, and it was clear that the company wasn't going to last. The only thing that held in the balance was a fantasy. A game that the head of development, Hironobu Sakaguchi, believed would either become the rope that could pull Square to safety, or the weak thread that would send them falling to failure. It was all up to the collective imagination of the individuals who would fulfill that dream. But how can we understand a dream without knowing the dreamers behind it? Therefore, we will take a step back. In this episode, we will uncover what these creators were like, what was at stake for the people involved, as well as investigating the self-inflicted pains that swelled with every direction that Square took, and how all of this culminated together and resulted in one of the most influential games of all time. This is the complete history of the game that started an empire. This is Final Fantasy. In the densely populated city of Yokohama, just on the edge of the Tokyo Bay, sat a small computer cafe. A dozen brand new Apple II computers resided inside the shop, all free of dust and awaiting use. Once powered on, the interior of their eggshell white casings thumped with a heartbeat of cutting-edge technology. These were the newest, most advanced models of the Apple II, and therefore the most expensive machines on the market. Unfortunately, this excluded the smart and broke university student from exploring the new hardware. To this end, the cafe was open for business. For an hourly fee, the new machines were accessible to motivated college students eager to learn from the new hardware and master its technology. The shop was a kind of precursor to the internet cafe decades before they would become popular. The year was 1983. The cafe's owner was Masafumi Miyamoto, a recent graduate from university. His father owned a powerline construction company called Denyu Sha, and in just a few weeks, this small cafe would soon become the software division known as Square. Miyamoto knew that he wanted to start a software company, but he didn't really know anything about computers. In fact, before he considered joining the computer industry, he wanted to create a woman's clothing line. When Miyamoto realized the potential hoard of yen he could rake in with software development, he ditched the clothes and dove right in. Despite his lack of knowledge, he believed that he knew a good computer game when he saw one, or so he thought. Now, Miyamoto's plan wasn't to make his millions on hourly rates from the cafe. No, far from it. This was his lure, his bait, a piece of candy to attract young programmers from the surrounding universities and get them into his cafe. Luckily, his siren song worked. Programming and engineering students flocked to the cafe at the hum of their alluring, powerful machines. There were two university students that would visit the shop regularly, Hiromichi Tanaka and Hironobu Sakaguchi. Both were engineering students and both were fascinated with the Apple II. At the time, new software was being developed at a rapid rate. The programming language Pascal, VisiCalc, and the appearance of role-playing games on the PC were among the advances. These RPGs took the features of tabletop games like Dungeons & Dragons and brought them to life in a digital format. Wizardry and Ultima in particular captivated Sakaguchi, and like a mountain to a mountaineer, he felt compelled to conquer and command the Apple II in all its facets. As an extremely determined individual, through every hour Sakaguchi spent working on the Apple II, he had incubated a need to create his own game. Sakaguchi and Tanaka progressed very quickly, becoming skilled and effective programmers. Miyamoto's plan was a success. He wouldn't have to go far to find new software developers to hire. They were right there in his cafe. It wasn't long before Miyamoto posted a job listing for a small software division. Sure enough, both Sakaguchi and Tanaka were among the first to apply. At first, things seemed to be going smoothly for the new startup, despite some initial friction between Miyamoto and Sakaguchi. Sakaguchi had established himself as a brilliant game designer in both his technical prowess as well as his great sense of storytelling. Comparatively, his boss Miyamoto had no level ground to stand on. So, when initial game designs were proposed by Miyamoto, they were often flat out rejected by Sakaguchi. He'd point out why his idea wouldn't work, and because Sakaguchi was a superior designer, he got away with it. Realizing that his lack of skills displaced his authority, Miyamoto withdrew himself from game design and hired Hisashi Suzuki both as an executive producer and as a mediator. Now, they had an appropriate workflow, a manager who understood games, and so they went right into production. Sakaguchi and Tanaka had developed the Death Trap, which was well received, selling 500,000 copies. Clearly, they were off to a good start, and yet the smooth path would quickly become marred. The sequel, entitled Will: The Death Trap 2, sold much less than the first game, even though they had took pains to promote the animated visual effects. The animations were simplistic, but striking for the time. Unfortunately, despite the impressive visuals, the game sold only 1/5 the amount of the original. It was a rough blow to the fledgling company, but every company had its bumpy starts. It wouldn't be like this for long, right? As for Sakaguchi, he was enjoying himself. After all, he was fulfilling his dream of creating games for a living. Before, he was just another starving student barely making ends meet. He still struggled at times, and he rarely left the office because they had an air conditioning and a shower, unlike his apartment. Though money was tight, Sakaguchi was satisfied. Of course, this wasn't the case for everyone. Across town, another dreamer was dreaming, but wasn't feeling nearly as fulfilled. In another part of town, a struggling musician named Nobuo Uematsu was working at his day job in a music rental shop. Uematsu loved rock music and taught himself how to play the piano. Sure, Led Zeppelin was great, but he would thoroughly bask in the fluid and unique melodies of Elton John, and his compositions reflected that same attention to melody. However, his skills were shadowed by his lack of credentials. It was hard for Uematsu to find work since he had no formal training, hence the music shop. During the day, he would rent equipment to working musicians while he stood behind the counter, wishing that he could one day play music for a living. Alas, he'd watch other musicians walk out the door, going on to their next gig, while he lingered in the shop with his dreams collecting dust on the shelf. It was under the blanket of night when Uematsu's dreams truly came to life. After work, he'd meet up with his friends. Ambitious people always seem to attract their own, and so every night was a party with an eclectic group of artists, musicians, actors, and one fortune teller. They would drink the night away, and they would all become intoxicated with conversations of dreams and fantasies. While toasting to their collective success, one woman at the party pulled Uematsu aside. She told him that Square was looking for someone to compose music for their video games. She emphasized that it would be a short-term project, only 2 games, as the company was just a handful of college students in a cafe. Uematsu was familiar with composing for video games and enjoyed the idea of being paid to write music. Of course he would do it, but he wasn't going to quit his day job. At least not yet. Meanwhile, Square had seen the path carved out by low sales, and with the view of this prospect, they began to regroup. They knew that their games were visually stunning, and they knew that text-based adventures were popular, so Square decided to embrace this combination. They held their focus on developing games for the PC, but would begin porting games as financial sustenance. In order to do this, they divided their staff into teams. Sakaguchi ran the A team, while Tanaka ran the B team. Each team would work concurrently on different games, thus producing more and bringing in more profits. Both teams already had games in development. Sakaguchi was busy developing a game of the big robot variety, Cruise Chaser Blasty, while Tanaka was producing a seemingly unusual title for Square's track record, an erotic game called Alpha. While Blasty's mechanized warfare game was common in Japan, a sexually suggestive space adventure was also common in Japan. As odd as it sounds, erotic games were quite popular in Japan. This genre is sometimes called eroge or hentai games, and they often featured suggestive or even pornographic anime-style images. Usually, the point of playing is based around nudity and having sex with the female characters in the game. Sometimes, this was in a boy meets girl, lighthearted tone, and at other times, these games went to dark places. To talk about this genre in detail is really for another video, but in relation to Alpha, the game straddles the edge of this genre with its suggestive images, but shines in contrast with its compelling setting that seems especially relevant today. Alpha depicts a future where humanity must rebuild civilization on a different planet. They locate this oasis planet and call it Alpha. The space travel would take several hundred years, and so an enormous space carrier is created to house thousands of people. Generations pass, and humanity is halfway there when a revolt breaks out. The focus then shifts to a woman named Chris, who must find the cause of the revolt by following clues while meeting friends and avoiding robots and rioters. This is where the game gets a little edgy. Although Chris is barely wearing any clothes and is seen throughout the game in suggestive stances or at revealing angles, there's one point where she is imprisoned, chained up, and is stripped naked for the player to see. Although Cruise Chaser Blasty is a decent game, Alpha stands out as an unusual addition to Square's catalog both then and now. Both games were visually well done, but the public was not impressed. There were some major problems with the gameplay. Blasty was complicated, and there were points where Alpha simply stopped working. In Alpha's case, if an incorrect text input was applied during a pivotal scene in the game, the plot wouldn't progress and would neglect to inform the gamer that they had made a bad choice. The player would be left wandering around trying to figure out what they had done wrong, and Square would be left doing much of the same. Miyamoto felt that they needed to reevaluate their stance in the market. After all, he wasn't interested in making beautiful games that didn't sell. Square was still a part of Denyu Sha, but now Miyamoto wanted to distance the failing division from his father's successful company. At the same time, he saw a great opportunity to plot a new course. Therefore, Square broke away from Denyu Sha and officially became Square Company Limited, while simultaneously creating a developing union called DOG. Though Square would have to go a step beyond corporate independence, they'd have to invest in themselves. Competing with the powerhouse developers in Japan was impossible if they were to retain the perspective of a small company. They'd at least have to get out of the cafe to be taken seriously. Simply put, they needed to be bigger. So, bigger they got. They moved into a new office in downtown Tokyo and switched their focus from PC games to developing titles for Nintendo's console, the Famicom. Also, Nintendo had recently dived into the North American market with the NES. Square would have to follow suit. In this, Miyamoto saw big things: international releases, pop star endorsements, and a larger staff. As for the staff they had, they all got promoted. Sakaguchi was now the director of planning and development, and Tanaka became the head designer. In the midst of this, Sakaguchi had thought of the composer that had done such great music for their games, and he wondered if he'd be willing to join Square full-time. Uematsu was still feeling the financial pinch of being a musician. It had been a few months since composing for Square, and he was looking for what was next on the horizon. His days were still spent withering away at the music shop, while his nights continued to thrive with dreams and laughter. One night, the fortune teller who had floated around the parties read Uematsu's fortune. He told him that next week something was going to happen, and that Uematsu would become widely known. At the time, Uematsu just thought he was drunk. Oddly enough, something did happen the following week. Uematsu ran into Sakaguchi on the street and offered him a job at Square. The thought of finally being able to quit his day job and create music for a living was enough for him. Sure, it wasn't a symphony, but within those 8-bit tones, Uematsu would have his own digital orchestra at the end of his fingertips. He was in, and suddenly, that fortune teller didn't seem that drunk. Along with Uematsu as a full-time composer, a few other big names were added to the team: Akatoshi Kawazu, Kenji Terada, and Koichi Ishii. Then, Square struck gold with the programming rockstar Nazar Gabelli, better known as just Nazar. Nazar was explosive when the Apple II first hit America. He was an extremely prolific programmer, releasing nearly a game a month at one point, all of which were critically acclaimed and popular. Gorgon, for example, was the best-selling computer game until 1982. Nazar had felt the heavy blow of the 1983 gaming crash, and as a result, retreated from gaming for a couple of years. In 1986, the great Nazar resurfaced with the intention to make games once again. Nintendo was on the tips of everyone's tongue, so he flew to Japan to offer his services. However, when Nazar met with Nintendo, They weren't interested. Sakaguchi was a huge fan of Nazar's work, so when he walked through the doors at Square, Sakaguchi was so excited that he asked him for his autograph. The fact that Nazar was offering his programming skills to Square left Sakaguchi nearly speechless. This was perfection. Square had a killer team, headed a developing union, and had a brand new console to conquer. It was on like Donkey Kong. Sakaguchi dug deep, went back to his roots, and uncovered gold in the form of an idea. The Apple II had fostered his desire to create games, especially the RPGs on the machine. Now, he wanted to make his own RPG. With the new fantastic team, they could make something unique and expansive. So, with idea in hand, he approached Square, only to be greeted by a brick wall. They said no. True, they had an incredible team, which meant that they should be making action games, not RPGs. RPGs were for PCs, not consoles. No one would buy an RPG. Plus, Nintendo's 3D peripheral was about to hit the market, and Nazar was well versed in 3D programming. Sakaguchi saw the logic in this, but he also felt the dismissive ease by which they brushed him aside and under the rug. This was the start of Sakaguchi being slowly downgraded at Square. Also, Sakaguchi's frustration began getting in the way of cooperating with others. He became harder to work with and unpopular within the company. If only they had allowed him to make his RPG. Little did anyone know that a rival developer, Enix, had already begun development on their own RPG. Square's next game, King's Knight, was not an RPG and was released to mediocre sales, while their projected 3D hit games, Rad Racer and 3D World Runner, were not as successful as hoped. Both games were criticized as being Sega knockoffs, but that wasn't the main issue. Even though all three games were released in North America and sold reasonably well, the problem was a financial imbalance. Square had put a lot of their capital into growing the company, and ultimately, it was a bad return on their investment. The company was writing checks that their games couldn't cash, and suddenly, the size of the company was an enormous problem. Shortly after these releases, Square had to let half their newly hired staff go. They desperately needed a game changer. In order to keep the company afloat, they would not only need a hit game, they would need a mega hit game. As a company, they pooled their remaining resources in order to make one last game. This game could save the company, so Square began development on their epic masterpiece, Miho Nakayama's Heartbeat High School. Wait, that can't be right. Yes, Heartbeat High School had it all. Anime-style characters, a cute gimmick, and the endorsement of Japanese pop star Miho Nakayama. In the game, Miho is pretending to be just another nerdy teenager in high school when you, the player, unaccidentally knock her glasses off and realize who she is, every boy's dream girl. The gimmick occurred mid-game when Miho would give a phone number to call. The player would then have to put down the controller, pick up the phone, and dial. On the other line, a pre-recorded message from Miho herself told you how to further progress in the game. But wait, there's more. A few lucky players who finished the game 3 months after its release got a special prize, a signed photo of Miho. Even if the game was horrible, which it was, all of the added gimmicks and goodies were almost enough to guarantee sales. Even Nintendo had a hand in it. Metroid co-creator Yoshi Sakamoto was enlisted to temporarily trade his space thriller ambiance for an 80s TV show turned video game. Oh, the humanity. As Square dangled above the abyss of bankruptcy, hanging on a thread of poor decisions, Sakaguchi saw a monster emerge before them, Enix's RPG. Dragon Quest took Japan by storm in May of 1986. Along with Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda, released earlier that year, it was clear that RPGs could sell and that gamers were ready for an adventure. Dragon Quest was an epic. It took days, if not weeks, to complete. The character art was stellar, which was to be expected since the creator of the very popular Dragon Ball series, Akira Toriyama, had done all the artwork. Word of mouth spread like wildfire. Dragon Quest was a behemoth. It literally was too cool for school. Enix was forbidden to release further Dragon Quest titles during the work week because too many people would skip school or work to go home and play the new release. Enix didn't waste any time either. Dragon Quest II hit shelves on a school day just 8 months after the original. When a Dragon Quest game was released, all of Japan shut down. It was a phenomenon that no one saw coming. Sakaguchi watched as this fire called Dragon Quest consumed the market. He looked at the direction of Square and realized he had a choice to make. One path led back to school and away from gaming. This was the more practical path, but it would immediately put a close to Sakaguchi's dream of creating games. However, Sakaguchi watched that very dreamscape disintegrate before his eyes. The other path was dismal at best. He would continue to make games that he didn't like for a company that clearly wasn't going to last. In true Sakaguchi fashion, rather than choose between two bad options, he would have it his own way. He would make one last game. This game would be his Ultima, his Sgt. Pepper's, his Paradise Lost. And if the game didn't sell, he'd go back to school. But if it did, it would prove to him that he was truly meant to be a game designer. Either way, he'd make his fantasy game, even if it would be his final project. Thus, Final Fantasy was born. Since Square was on the verge of collapse, they didn't jump at the idea of making Sakaguchi's game. Even with the proven road paved by Dragon Quest, Sakaguchi nearly begged Square to let him make Final Fantasy. Sakaguchi was given a reluctant okay, and he wrote up the plans. Even with the low staff, they still held their team meetings, wherein the team directors would propose their games and have employees join. Despite being the head of the A-team, Sakaguchi's unpopularity could not have been more evident than it was at this time. No one expected Sakaguchi's game to sell, and most of the company didn't want to develop it. When Sakaguchi presented Final Fantasy to the company, a total of 3 people joined the team. This was salt in a gaping wound. There was no way he was going to make a game with just 4 people. So he convinced 2 more people to join, Koichi Ishii and Akatoshi Kawazu. Final Fantasy's development was underway, but like a treacherous mountain pass, Sakaguchi would have to fight through every aspect of its creation. Whether this was his last game or not, the journey of its development would leave a deep, deep scar that would either make him stronger or topple him over. Determined, Sakaguchi would not back down from a challenge, even if the challenger was his own company. It started with the music. Square wanted to take the digital orchestra out of Uematsu's hands. Politely, Uematsu was prepared to relinquish his services until Sakaguchi stepped in. He told Uematsu to disregard the request and to go ahead and create his own compositions. When it came to coding, there was yet another obstacle to contend with. The great programmer Nazar was bewildered by the RPG genre. He didn't understand it. Sakaguchi would have to explain certain aspects of the gameplay. Hit points, for instance, baffled Nazar. He'd ask, if they're hit, why don't they just fall down? After a while, Sakaguchi got tired of explaining and said, forget why they don't fall down, just code it. One major focus of Sakaguchi's team was to distance themselves from Dragon Quest as much as possible. It was hard to compete with Akira Toriyama's artwork, but if they could find someone that was unique in style, it could help set Final Fantasy apart. Sakaguchi had been collecting magazine clippings and mangas searching for that unique style. One day, Ishii walked by Sakaguchi's desk and suggested an up-and-coming manga artist named Yoshitaka Amano. Sakaguchi looked up and said, "No way, I never heard of that guy. What I want is stuff like this. Look." Ishii took one look at Sakaguchi's clippings and said, "Hey, Amano drew these." Amano had been working as an artist for most of his life. His designs for the Vampire Hunter D and the Gatchaman manga were well known. Amano had started his career with an animation studio in Tokyo when he was 15, but by the time he was 30, he felt the need to walk down a different road. It was around this time when Sakaguchi invited him to create the characters for Final Fantasy. Amano instantly jumped on board, but even this great addition came with a little hiccup. Given the 8-bit limitations of video games, Amano tried to adjust his style to mimic the dotted look of game sprites, but Sakaguchi, appreciating his fluid and flowing art style, asked him to draw the portraits that he was accustomed to. Amano's art was perfect for Final Fantasy, which was gradually becoming a piece of art itself. There were still moments when Sakaguchi let his frustration get the best of him, and his impatience was evident among the team. At times, he would say things like, "This is impossible with this team. but rather than discouraging them, the team would push harder and work longer. They all started to believe in Sakaguchi's fantasy and began adding nuance to every aspect of the game. For instance, Kawazu wanted to bring more elements of Dungeons & Dragons into the battle sequence. To him, other RPGs thus far had neglected the elemental aspects of combat, such as fire kills zombies, water dispatches fire-based enemies, and so on. As for the epic quest, the story goes as follows. The heroes of light were called upon to revive the elemental orbs by defeating the four fiends. The main protagonist, Garland, became a much more sinister foe as the game progressed into a complex tale. The four fiends had sent Garland back in time, while Garland sent the four fiends into the future so that they can send him back to the past, thus creating a complex paradox wherein Garland, revealed to be the archdemon Chaos, would live forever. The heroes of light would have to traverse an expansive world using airships, boats, and time travel in order to restore the land to its once balanced state. Revealing of its developers, once the heroes of light defeated Chaos in the past, they returned to a present where everything was in its rightful place, but no one knew of their valiant acts outside of legend. All their efforts would be unknown to the world that they had just saved. Clearly, a reflection of Sakaguchi's own feelings about his great effort in creating this masterpiece and the potential fear that no one would know of it. However, people within Square knew that the A-Team was creating an amazing game. Even others outside the team began to contribute, including Tanaka. It was gaining a life of its own, and it was quickly becoming larger than the parts it took to create it. Then one day, Final Fantasy's development was complete, and it was now ready for cartridge production. This brings us to that familiar point in the journey where the heroes think that they've completed their task, only to learn that a more diabolical force was just beyond the veil. Production and promotion were the fiends that lie in wait. Square was nearly all out of resources by the time Final Fantasy was finished, and they could not afford a massive cartridge production, nor could they risk a costly promotional campaign for the game. To lower cost, Square would only manufacture 200,000 copies. In Square's defense, this was the best that they could do, but Final Fantasy was Sakaguchi's baby, and he wouldn't have it rot on the vine. It was up to Sakaguchi to make it right. He negotiated and pleaded with the manufacturer to create more ROMs. He knew that manufacturing ROMs took roughly 3 months to complete, and if they only made 200,000 copies, that would be all they could sell. With his efforts, Sakaguchi was able to double the amount, getting 400,000 copies made. Now, all that was left was promotion. Square was almost bankrupt, so Sakaguchi had to promote the game by himself. He took demos of the game to every news and gaming outlet he could find. A number of magazines turned him down, but luckily the gaming magazine Famitsu saw how great the game was and agreed to advertise for Final Fantasy. Every idea that they collectively had was condensed inside Final Fantasy, which was unlike most other games. Usually during development, designers would put game ideas aside and save it for a sequel. Dragon Quest did this, which is why the sequel was released just 8 months after the original. This conservative mindset often worked for other companies, but no one at Square believed that there was going to be a company left, let alone a sequel. Final Fantasy was just that, final. It was a dream's end, which contained all other dreams from a group of people who believed in the same thing. Both Square and Sakaguchi's future were hanging in question, and the only thing that held in the balance was this game. Final Fantasy was released on December 17th of 1987, and they sold every copy made. Square had reluctantly bet it all on Sakaguchi's game, and Final Fantasy was a resounding success. It was a major hit in Japan, although not outselling Dragon Quest's 1.5 million copies sold, a solid 400,000 copies put Final Fantasy in second place. Critics did point out similarities between Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, but there are enough differences to allow Final Fantasy to stand out. Most notably, the battle screen animations were like nothing ever seen and have since become a staple of the entire genre. From the engrossing story to the expansive world, to the characters' growth and the battles fought, Final Fantasy was a true masterpiece. It had saved Square and gave Sakaguchi a reason to continue creating games. Looking back, it seemed unclear where Square's path was going to lead. They went from being a PC game developer focused on impressive visuals to some indistinct titles that reflected their lack of direction. Final Fantasy had changed the course of Square permanently. They now had a distinct voice and they would create RPGs exclusively. In the midst of this creative endeavor, something truly special occurred. 3 individuals came together to combine their specific talent, art, music, and storytelling in order to accomplish something that they could not have done separately. Amano, Uematsu, and Sakaguchi may have come from different walks of life, but each one with their respective art forms was searching for a new plateau to reach, and Final Fantasy became that point. It was a collective masterpiece that somehow became more than the sum of its parts. Greeted by a brighter day and a clearer path, they would rise to the challenge and find a way to do it all again. Tune in next time to see Square level up. I'm Josh Drew. Thanks for watching.